Thanks, everybody. It's great to have you all here. I think we've got a good group, and I hope you're energized. I am. I'm going to ask my colleague Roman to put the PowerPoint back up while I just take a quick moment to review the job service process that we've been engaging in on these meetings and where we are. We talked about earlier where we've been and some of the things that we've done together. And now we are in the investigate phase of the job service process. And the activities of that phase that we've engaged in so far is to convene stakeholders, like all of us, exploring the challenges and exploring labor market conditions and economic opportunities. We've talked a little bit about what the data reveals or confirms or the questions that it raises, and discussed funding opportunities with NYSERDA and NYCHA and some others. And we've worked together with all of you to define the barriers and identify opportunities for greater coordination. And today we're going to look at asset infrastructure. What resources exist, how are they utilized, leveraged, and how aware are we of them? Next slide, please. So this is just the kind of going over what I just said, where we are in the process. And the next slide. All right. So before we hear from Chris Collins, I have one last poll for today that we're going to administer. And we're looking for volunteers actually to help plan focus groups. So the way Google polling, Zoom polling works is I combine these. So only pick one or both of these. You can pick both if you want, if you're interested. And then in the back end, I'll see based on email addresses who has volunteered. And this will be probably February, probably March. A lot of this will get done, maybe sooner. But we'll start to reach out to you to talk about how to plan those. So just give folks a minute to think about it. A few more seconds. All right, any final responses? Let's get those in. And you also have my email address and could always reach out to me, but I think that's enough time. Great. So I will get those lists and reach out to folks who volunteered, and I thank you in advance. And we can close the poll. And now it's my pleasure to invite our partner, Jen Mitchell, Executive Director of the HOPE program. And little known fact, or a fact that I learned recently, is that Jen is also a former Peace Corps volunteer in Bluefields, Nicaragua. So maybe that's what inspired her passion for sustainability. She's going to introduce our guest speaker for today.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Carrie. I actually was an environmental policy major in college, which inspired me going to Bluefields, Nicaragua as an environmental education volunteer. And so thrilled to be here now doing environmental and workforce development work together with all of you. So meeting number 4 of the new Green Economy Network. It is really great to be here. Lizette in the last meeting reiterated our vision for this, which is to create a network that works and focuses towards building consistent career paths to good green jobs with a focus on priority and inclusion. And it's going to take all of us in this network to make that a reality. At the launch back in November, we talked about giving ourselves, this Green Economy Network community, the opportunity to get to know each other, to build trust, and ultimately to figure out ways to collaborate. We also talked about the necessity of going from theoretical to practical. And I think today's agenda reflects both of these goals. It also feels incredibly timely, and I'm confident that together we can seize the moment we're living in and really so many people said solution as what they're here for. I think we can really together build, find, innovate, create solutions to get us there. Right now, the climate crisis is at the forefront of people's minds, as is the necessity to build back using both an environmental lens and a racial justice lens. And though so much feels really overwhelming and daunting these days, there is a lot to be hopeful about as well. There are exciting green opportunities coming out on city, state, and federal levels to support an equitable and inclusive and sustainable recovery. There are investments that are being made in infrastructure, in transportation, in energy, and so many other sectors that look really promising. There are initiatives coming out that encourage local hiring, incentivizing renewable energy, and creating good green jobs. So, using his own experience to help us wrap our minds around the current climate, no pun intended, look in the right places, focus our efforts, and in his own words, follow the money, it's my great pleasure to introduce Chris Collins. Chris, as you all know from the introductions, if you didn't know before, is the executive director of Solar One. Solar One is an award-winning organization with a thriving array of programs that promote urban sustainability and education throughout New York City. Probably many of you on the call today your organizations have at some point partnered with Solar One. I know we have at Hope. Chris was a moderator for a panel at our Green Economy launch back in November, and we're fortunate to have him back to talk to us today about some of the opportunities, his organization's journey thus far, and the lessons they have learned. His full bio can be found through a link in the agenda, but without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and I'll be back in a little while to help facilitate questions. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Jennifer. Appreciate it. I'm going to, as you were indicated, I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we're building a market in a clean energy space, albeit a small one at start, and how it might inform building a new inclusive green economy. But before I do that, my focus will be on energy because that's what we do the most. But before I do that, let me just tell you about Solar One. If we go to the first slide. So Solar One started about, next slide. That one. So Solar One started about 2004, and we started over on the East River at 23rd Street. We put up a small standalone solar powered building, and we started doing education there. And over time, people would come to the building to learn about solar, about energy efficiency in buildings, water quality, and horticulture, because we maintain Stuyvesant Cove Park. But over time, we started to develop some lesson plans. And if you want to go to the next slide, we developed a K through 12 education program focused on energy, food, water, materials, climate change, and air quality. And over time, that program has evolved to the point where in about 2010, we developed a program that we actually go into the schools where students spend 7 hours a day and use the school building as a learning lab to teach about those subjects. Over time, we've become an institutional partner with DOE, doing after-school trainings, teacher trainings, and in-school classroom residencies, as well as more recently working with the CTE program on solar installation, both for teachers and for students. Next slide. About 2010, a number of the large workforce agencies in the city, like Strive and Fortune and Green City Force and others, went after and got some of the ARA stimulus money that was designed for building out green jobs. And we probably all remember that. And a number of those organizations work with un- and underemployed individuals, and they came to us because they didn't know anything about the actual green job training component of it. So they came to us and asked us if we would help them teach their students in cohorts for anywhere from a week to 5 weeks of hands-on training. Next slide, please. So we built out a lab in Long Island City. And we started offering course training, hands-on training for their cohorts in a variety of areas, principally in green building operations and maintenance. You may remember the weatherization kind of activities, green construction, electrical, plumbing, and more recently, solar PV installation training. We do more of that in 2012, 2013. The market hadn't really matured enough. Solar was still pretty expensive. And so we discouraged employers from coming to us or partners from coming to us for solar PV installation, and decided that we'd rather offer carpentry, electrical, and plumbing as sort of cross-transferable skills. And as time has progressed and the price of solar has come down, we now offer solar PV installation training. We do HVAC training as well as air source heat pump training. We do some OSHA training, and we also do some certifications for Building Performance Institute, GPRO, and NABCEP. Next slide, please. This is just a visual of some of our students going through the program, doing some of those hands-on activities. Next slide. And this is pretty obvious. Someone's building out a solar array at our lab over in Long Island City. Next slide, please. So partnering is kind of built into our DNA. When we started over in the East River at 23rd Street, we were kind of behind Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper. Nobody knew who we were. It was 2004. And in order to be able to increase our impact, we realized very early that we needed to partner with lots of different organizations. So in our workforce training program, we partner with a lot of different workforce agencies. These are a sample of some of the ones that are our partners that we work with. And we don't typically do placement. We leave that to our partners to do, but we will do the hands-on training component, and more often we're starting to do some of the placement, or at least consulting and career opportunities. Next slide. In 2014, NYSERDA came to us and said, you know, the price of solar is coming down, and we really need to figure out how to bring down the balance of systems costs for solar. And by that, I mean the price of the panels had come down in 2014, 15, but there was a stubbornly high 40% of the cost was in customer acquisition, building permits, energy, interconnection with Con Ed. And they asked us if we would figure out how we might be able to bring down the balance of systems cost. And so we started to look at that, and we figured out a solution to it. And I'll get into it in a slide or two. But essentially, our program right now focuses on affordable housing, community solar, solar basically in New York City for renters, market rate multifamily buildings, and we do a little bit of solar and energy storage systems. We're doing 11 sites with the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery around the city of various community center type buildings for emergency preparedness in the future. Next slide, please. I put this up because it tugs at me. You can see in the left side of that slide, there's a picture of a number of people up on a roof. This is up in Washington Heights, and Cecil Corbin Mark is in the center of it. Gail Brewer's to the left, and Juan Power on our staff is to the right. And I always put that up there because Cecil is such a key player and such an important person to me as well as to Solar One. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that NYSERDA came to us and said, we want to reduce these balance of systems costs. And so we said, well, all right, the single most important reason why someone goes solar is if they see it on someone else's roof. And so we started a Solarize campaign in Brooklyn, targeting 1 to 4 family row houses. And this goes back to 2015, 16. And we did a sort of massive outreach, and we signed up 350 families, buildings to go solar. And we went out and we provided free assessments of their roofs. We did working with the installers. We did some energy calculations for them and tried to get as many of those people as possible to go forward. Of the 353 that signed up, only 23 buildings went forward. And we thought that was not a very good result. So we drilled down a little bit on it, and we determined that the problem was both an installer problem and also a building owner problem. The installers were really overwhelmed by the number of buildings. There were one-off projects, and they had a lot of ancillary problems getting parking tickets, just a host of different things, going out and having to do 350 different assessments. And the homeowners were also unsatisfied. And so we thought, what if we started making smaller groups geographically connected of building owners, and get a group of 8 or 10 building owners together, do some feasibility studies that we would do for them. We would do a little bit more financing stuff, packaging, and then we would group them together and send them out to bid to installers. And what we found was that the installers would come back and bid generally 15 to 20% below market. So that was a pretty good savings. And we realized that through this bulk purchasing process, we could accomplish more and it would cost less. And the result of that campaign is that we had 120 buildings go forward with solar. So we knew we were onto something, and the cost started to come down by virtue of this bulk purchasing. So the work that we do here is listed in this slide. We do feasibility studies, we do knowledge building, we do financing and incentive consultation, and then we do bulk procurement and solar, and we help the buildings select solar installers. And we handed off the installers at that point, and then get out of the process, and it's between the installers and the homeowners at that point. Next slide. So we started to pivot away from 1 to 4 family row homes, and we focused more on affordable housing and low and moderate income housing. And so this is a slide that will give you an example of one of the ones we did in West Harlem. This was led by We Act, and it was Uptown Solar Now program. We got 11 co-op buildings bundled together and sent them out for bid, and we ended up with 30% lower than pricing than average. There was a job training and local hiring commitment that was made. And that program then led to another one that catalyzed another program that we're doing with UHAB called Co-ops Go Solar, to bring solar and HVAC co-ops citywide. And we've had 22 affordable co-ops going forward. Next slide. Community power, community shared solar started to come on the scene. And we started a program with Con Ed and with all the partners listed on this to install 1.2 megawatts of solar on 36 buildings across 3 NYCHA complexes in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Those are actually under construction now. Next slide. There was a local training component, and this is Clifton Bryant, who came to us from the Green City Force, and he's now been promoted to a pod leader. And I think the Carver houses in East Harlem are up and done, and they've moved on to the Brooklyn campuses for that. Next slide. And with our workforce, just like workforce, here comes Solar Partners with as many different organizations as possible. And this is a representative sample. Finally, next slide. We started to partner with HPD and NYSERDA to develop a solar where feasible policy program for HPD's programs, refinancing programs. And the policy requires solar for all new construction and preservation projects when it's cost effective. So we're working with HPD on implementing that project across their entire portfolio over the course of the next 3 years. So there's a market that we're building there. Next slide. So we have about 500 buildings in our pipeline. And we are starting to connect our Here Comes Solar pipeline with trainees coming out of our program. In the RFPs that we send out, we encourage employers to hire people coming out of our program. They'll be given favorable consideration if they commit to doing that. And that's how we're able to do this. It's not a lot of jobs. In the NYCHA example above, I think we're able to get 13 students placed on the NYCHA project. But it's a start, and it's a way that we've been building, and if we can build the capacity, we can build more opportunity. We started an LLC that's going to be focused on market rate housing, precisely for the purpose of expanding our capacity and taking that savings that we have in the affordable housing space and putting that savings to work so that we can get more market rate housing out there doing solar and more opportunity for job training. Next slide. So quickly, this is where I had wanted to have a lot of conversation, but obviously to refresh, we're looking at energy in the green sectors, waste reduction management, green infrastructure, green spaces and parks, horticulture and food production, and transportation. As you all have discussed previously, we are looking at occupation greening, so the peripheral jobs that are green, existing jobs have a green component to them, and then actually new green jobs like solar and wind installers, energy efficiency jobs, new projects like the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, locally grown food and things like that. This is hard stuff. We have to step back a little bit and realize that, we're really creating a new economy here. This is not like a small thing. This is a really, really big thing. It's a seismic shift, much like the Industrial Revolution, the technology revolution was a big shift. And I think it's important that we're going to have to drill down on this stuff in a lot of detail, both on the job creation front, but also on where's the funding coming from to scale these programs and to scale this economy quickly. Next slide. So we have to identify the jobs. We have to identify the skills that are needed. We have to map the jobs and the skills and the people, and we have to create a process for connecting people to these jobs. When I do that, when I look for where are these jobs, I generally look at following the money. Next slide. And that there are basically 4 places where money is going to come from. It's going to come from the government. It's going to come from Wall Street. It'll come from industry. Industry will invest in things and people, assuming they have the funding. And then private and philanthropic funding will also supply some of it as a way of jumpstarting both government funding and potentially Wall Street funding. Next slide. Quick case study of a government agency that got it right. In 2016, New York State created the Clean Energy Fund, a $5 billion investment to implement the Reforming the Energy Vision. And NYSERDA was charged with administering it through the Public Service Commission. And initially, NYSERDA submitted 118 initiatives that they wanted to fund through the Clean Energy Fund. And PSC came back and said, wait a minute, 115 initiatives, and you're never going to get all of those done well. And so basically, they sent them back and they said, look, we want you to pare this down to 10 or 12, and we want you to write chapters, detailed chapters about how you're going to spend this money and what you're going to use it for. And we want to know how you're going to report back to us on it. And to their credit, NYSERDA has created a workforce initiative, with $100 million of funding for clean energy workforce development and training. That is a chapter. It is at the Public Service Commission today. You can go and look at it, and you can see the roadmap of what NYSERDA is implementing over the course of the next 5 years. Next slide. So NYSERDA implemented a workforce training initiative. Their initial ponds, this is where they're really doing well. They're learning as they go. Their initial ponds focused on training. The next pond focused on training in specific sectors. The next round required training in specific sectors with an employer committed to hiring those trainees. That's pond 3981. And then the next round, which is kind of out in the street right now, has added an employer component that the training has to have an 80% placement rate, and at least 50% of the students have to come from priority populations. And on top of it, they now have 2 ponds out there, one that provides for on-the-job training stipends, and one that provides subsidies for internships for up to 24 weeks to employers. So they've learned and evolved this program in a way where I think they finally got it right. They have the training, they have the sectors, they have the job employers, they have the communities that need to be trained, and they have subsidized wages for a period of time to get those people employed and get employers into the program. Next slide.
And Chris, just as you're going on to the next slide, I just want to be aware of time. So we're probably going to have, if you have a couple more minutes, and then we have a couple minutes for questions.
I'm going to slide through this very quickly. And these could actually be just related, but I'm just listed out some of the
Great.
big
And you have a weird echo right now.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm not sure what that's about, but is it still doing it?
Yeah. Try to mute and unmute.
I'm gonna mute and unmute. Is that any better?
No.
All right, I'm gonna go off video. Maybe my internet will be better. Is that any better? Is that better for sound?
No, it's still like a vibrating mute. A vibrating echo.
All right. I think the way to end this is to there's 3 slides here on various initiatives, 4 slides. And I think that you can just share that through the presentation afterwards. And I will dial in.
Chris, because we have trouble hearing you, do you want to leave the Zoom, re-enter, and people will put questions in the chat for you as you leave and re-enter?
Yep. That's what I'll do.
All right, while Chris is trying to get back on without the echo, I see there's been a couple questions put in the chat already, but please feel free to put more questions in the chat, because probably what we'll do in the interest of time is have Chris, when he gets back on, which he might be, Kerry's indicating he's back on, but we'll have him wrap up his presentation, and then we'll have him answer some of the questions in the chat through the chat. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Chris.
Sorry, I'm also mindful of time. The next 4 slides are really different kinds of funding initiatives that are out there. And I think the point I'm trying to make with all these, and we can circulate the presentation afterwards, is that you have to dig into the details on funding. Whether it's federal, state, or city initiatives, each of these initiatives are either short, medium, or long-term initiatives. Some of them are aspirational. Some of them are budget proposals the governor's put forward that are not yet law. They're not going to be, they have to go through a whole process. But some of them are immediate. And those are the ones that I think, we focus on as an organization when we know that there's mandates involved, because that's going to generate activity. And we know that there's actual real funding involved. The one that's up right now, there's mandates. The Pathway Pledge is great in terms of corporations signing on to take on more inclusive development opportunities. but until I actually see it happening, it's still an aspirational goal. Next slide is I think some more of the governor's state of the state budget initiatives, all aspirational at this point. And the next slide, city, this is a renewable Rikers initiative. It's aspirational still. It's got to go through the city council and get passed. But if it does happen, it's going to be a huge opportunity for job creation. And the next slide is the Climate Mobilization Act. Obviously, that's a mandate, and there's going to be a bunch of jobs coming through that. But how the funding is going to happen for that and where those jobs are still up in the air. There'll be a lot of energy efficiency jobs coming through, probably some solar jobs and some green roof jobs once the new construction mandates take effect in a few years. The East Side Coastal Resiliency Project is projects that's happening right now. And that is, I know the local community has been really kind of up in arms because they have been trying to get 30% minority participation into that project, and it's not been very transparent. So that's the presentation. I'd be glad to answer questions for a few minutes. I know I went a pretty long time there, but I hope that was helpful.
Chris, it was great. And there are lots of questions coming in on the chat. So I'm going to take the, there was a first question that came in that was one really relevant to workforce development in the green sector. And it was, what do you think is the greatest hurdle for workforce development for your trainees? And so it would be great if you could speak to that, since there's so many workforce development providers on the call. And then if you can take a few minutes while we take the break to answer some of the questions in the chat via the chat, that would be amazing. So take this one, and then the rest of the chat would be awesome.
All right. I think the greatest hurdle for the population we deal with, the greatest hurdle is finding a job for them within 3 months of completion of the course. And that's a huge challenge. And we work with our workforce agency partners to try and get them connected with employers. But it's right now the market's so nascent that it's hard to get large numbers of people employed. The NYCHA work that we're doing is a large cohort of students that have actually gotten jobs. But usually our pipeline yields 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 per big project. So we're hopeful that as we build this out a little bit more, that we'll have more opportunity. And then I guess the other piece of it is to do a lot of the solar work, you need to have fairly good math skills. So you really have to have students have to be prepared to do a certain level of math. And so we encourage our partners to make sure that that's the case as well.
Thank you so much. And there are lots of, or at least 4 or 5 other questions came through the chat. And I'm going to turn it back to Carrie. Chris, we appreciate your wisdom and your insights and you sharing your experience so honestly and thoughtfully with us.
Sure. I will reply to these.
Carrie,
Chris and Jennifer, thank you both so much. Chris, that was amazing. So many people have questions, and we wanted to give just like a quick break now. If people want to stay and not go on a break and talk with Chris, that's fine too. The break was mainly for you to go and get some blank pieces of paper and pens and pencils. So if you have that near you and you want to talk to Chris, go ahead. But let's all just take 2 minutes to gather stuff and maybe stretch, get a drink, and be back here, let's say 11:05.
Yep, I'll stay on if anybody has any questions. I'll answer those and then I'll go on to the chat and answer those.
All right, thank you, Chris. Sorry to take the break away from you.
No problem. I'm sorry I ran over, but.
No, it's totally fine. Chris, if you want, are you reading the questions in the chat, or do you want me to read them to you so you can answer some of them out loud?
Sure, if you wouldn't mind doing that, that'd be great.
Great. Okay. So the next one that came in was just asking about the scale and impact of your solar energy installation. Specifically, what is the proportion of your installation's megawattage within New York City's energy generation?
That's so it's a drop in the bucket. We are doing about 20 megawatts, and that that is not a lot. If you look at what our peak usage is on any given hot summer day, we go up to 13,000 megawatts. So 20 megawatts is a small drop in the bucket. But I think what's important about that is that's a capacity issue on our end. If we had more people, we could generate more business. Solar, the return on investment for solar is still very strong. So even with COVID and even with the economy crashing, there is money out there to invest in the development of solar, and that's not the issue. The issue is really having the funding to be able to build out the staff to bring more buildings into the pipeline, which in turn can then create more jobs. And I think part of the HPD work we're going to be doing will do that as well.
Okay, and then last question I'm going to ask before the break, and then you can answer the rest in the chat, is curious, lots of people thanking you for the presentation, but this one says, curious whether the hypothesis is that if you build a stronger bridge between job trainees and Solar One's growing projected pipeline, the solar companies will retain the workforce graduates for the long term. Is there anything else you all are doing to try to get that outcome, meaning the outcome of long-term employment?
Yeah, it's all about building that pipeline. If you have enough of a pipeline and you can keep the installers busy, you can then just roll the students from one job to the next. And so the NYCHA example, those students are on the roofs right now. That project's going to go through to April, and then hopefully there'll be another round of buildings that we'll send out for bid. And if that installer wins that bid, then they will go ahead and continue with those students as well. And of course, the installers have other business as well as the business they get from us. So they have been showing some interest in keeping some of the people that we have on the NYCHA project on board for future jobs.
Wonderful. All right. And back to Carrie. And I credit to you, Chris. I think most people did not take their break because they wanted to hear what you had to say. So thanks again. And over to you, Carrie.
Yeah, thank you so much. And continue, post questions in chat. Chris is part of our ongoing group here working together, and we can always get questions and answers going back and forth in email as well.
I'll be glad to do that. I'll do that right now.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, Roman, if I could ask you to put back up the PowerPoint, and I think we should be on slide 49. One after that, yeah. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about sector mapping before we go into the breakout groups. And forgive me if I go a little bit too fast, but know that each of the breakout groups will have facilitators in them with the instructions that are also on your participant agenda. So everything that I go over now, you'll have it in multiple places to reference. But first, I just want to talk about the concept of sector mapping, which it's a simple tool to think about a sector strategy. And it's designed to help you reflect on the various systems and clarify what your thinking is around those strategies. So building on everything that we've been hearing over the past few sessions, and of course, everything that Chris just shared about how, this really is a ginormous system, and breaking it down into the pieces and the actors and how they're connected and how we're all interconnected is what the mapping is for. So the objectives are to provide a tool to help you think about the sector as a whole and see where the system succeeds and where it breaks down, to reflect on your organization's position within the green economy and think about the sector as a whole, how workers, businesses, other systems that are currently connected, how they connect, how they might conflict, how they reinforce or interact. And it's also to identify the relationships, the dynamics and challenges of the sector in order to develop new or enhanced existing strategies or partnerships to address partnership and systems change opportunities. So this is something that we all talked about when we were going around the room of what we're looking for, solutions, and this is a way to move toward that. Next slide, please. So big picture, what you're going to be doing is kind of brainstorming a list, categorizing that list, and drawing a map. And you're mapping your universe of connection. So the first step is brainstorming the actors in your universe. We'll take a few minutes to do this in our breakout groups, but together, alone together. And you'll think about the institutions, the organizations, who's involved, and who should be involved in an industry-led partnership. And then that list is going to include the principal actors in each of the systems and organizations. So think about trade associations, chambers of commerce, unions, workforce development organizations, education and training institutions, support service providers, investors, on and on. And if you can't name who the principal actor is, you just think about the full organization. And so next slide is going to give an example of someone having done this. So this is just an example. It's no one in this group. It's not me. It's an example of a sector mapping exercise, and it was done by a workforce board. So the workforce board was the center, and the list of actors there are categorized. So in the next slide, I'll explain how we categorize them. I see something in the chat. I'll look at that in a minute. So you're going to code your actors, and you're going to do that in two ways. So first, all of the actors, and you'll see that list again, that example, you're going to mark them with VI for very important, I for important, or NI for not important, depending upon how you see their role in an industry-led partnership. And then you're going to mark them with an S for strong, an M for mediocre, and a W for weak in terms of your relationship with them. Next slide, please. So back to that same example, you see how they did that. So the job center is very important, a strong relationship. Going further down the line, the SBDC is important and a weak relationship. Next slide. So then you're going to draw this out on a blank piece of paper. You make yourself the center. You're the center of your universe for now. And you're going to draw all the other actors around you. And you'll have big circles for very important, medium circles for just important, and small circles for not important. And then the proximity to you is the strength of your relationship. So let's go to the next one where you can see a picture of what I'm talking about. Yeah, so that list is drawn out here. So the workforce board in the center, and you could see a small circle very close, VR, means they don't see them as very important, but they have a strong relationship. Whereas go a little further out, the Springfield Community College, they see them as very important, and maybe they have like a mediocre relationship. And then further out, the relationship's weak. So you kind of get the sense here of what their universe looks like to them. Next slide. This is another example. The neighborhood house was the center. They got a little creative making the hospital a symbol, but you get the idea. Next slide. And then we're going to share that. There's a step 4 that we're skipping where you make yourself not the center, where we could do that on our own, but in the interest of time, we're going to discuss this with your breakout group. So you draw it, and then you're all going to share and talk about it. And there's a set of questions that the facilitators will go through with you. So as we get ready to put you in breakout groups, I'm going to, let's see, I assigned folks to rooms, but we may have lost some folks along the way. So I'm going to just add them here. And okay, everyone should have a breakout room assignment. And when you get in there, the facilitators will go through these steps. If you want to open up your public agenda, that's a good idea. We could put that link again in the chat. And each breakout room has their own section, a duplicate table with the same information in it. And Kathleen and Trey will lead one, Jen and Aram another, Zakia and Renee another, and Tanya and Eric another. So we'll have 4 rooms, and I'm going to open those up now. And just accept the invitation and get creative. Thinking about the exercise you just did, what was easy about developing the maps? I'll just go through all the questions, and maybe somebody from each room could kind of report out or just raise your hand to speak. So what was easy about developing these maps, and what did you find hard? What insights did you gain from the process of drawing a map? What did you realize that you knew, and what did you realize you didn't know? How did listening to others describe their experience help you understand your own? And as you looked at different maps in the group, what caught your attention? So it'd be great if the either facilitator or a volunteer from each room could kind of share out a little bit on insights from the room.
I'm happy to jump in. We didn't have that much time for discussion, as like, it was kind of like 3 minutes. What's our takeaway? 4 minutes, what's our takeaway? But at the end, as we got cut off, we were all kind of laughing that one of the things we realized we needed to strengthen was our relationships with unions. And, you know, we didn't go that into it because it was cutting off, but like in my chart, I had like learning more about apprenticeship programs. And then the other big takeaway in our group was that we all had trouble not thinking that all of our relationships were very important. And so maybe the lesson that is we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about like what is really important and where to focus our time and energy.
That's a great point to raise, like what makes a relationship important, and something to think about and discuss. You know, there's the importance in what you can leverage from a relationship, or there are other things that make it important, right? What you learn from a partner, or support that they provide. That's great. Thank you, Jen. Can we hear from someone from one of the other rooms?
Hi, it's Kathleen. We too didn't get to, I'll stop my video in case. Can you hear me, Carrie?
Yep.
We too didn't get to talk a lot about, okay, now that we look at our map and what's missing, but I found, and we found it interesting to it was hard to think about, okay, what lens am I looking at this from in terms of how am I mapping this out? And then again, as Jen said, thinking about what are the important relationships and how do we view relationships compared to each other, was something that I think, you know, from those of us that were able to share back, we shared.
Okay. Thank you. And let's see, Zakia, Tanya, what about in your room?
Hello. So we too ran low on time, but we sort of looked at each other's relationships. Someone talked about the disconnect between employers and funders and linking folks to long-term jobs. Someone else talked about the various levels of relationships in terms of higher education, state level, local level. And then we had a great suggestion for putting our maps together, which we didn't have time to do, but I think that that's a really good idea to just look at how all of our networks connect. So hopefully we'll have some time to do that in the future.
Yeah, like that's great, Zakia, and that is the ultimate goal, right? Of like putting all of our maps up on the wall and then figuring out how they connect and how this network forms, you know, where the overlaps, where the synergies, what fills the gaps in what relationships. So that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I would, Eric had some AV issues, but if anyone else in the group wants to join, please jump in. But generally we made our list and we talked about our list, so we didn't get to show each other's maps so much because we ran out of time for there. But a lot of the headlines were to Jen's point, like we didn't put things down that were considered not important because we're focusing on what was actually important. So that sort of category fell off. But it talked a lot about sort of how you leverage the different parts, for example, the city government relationships to inform the federal, and and how a city could be very important because it's informing a federal, which might not be as important, but related. And so we talked about connections even between the different categories of connection, how they work together. And then a lot about just sort of like shared needs across the board of like partnership, because like joint stakeholders, NYCHA, for example, has so much need that like everyone has a contribution to make in terms of like relationships and partners there. I don't know if anyone else in the group wants to add to that.
Yeah, and what about just hearing from some of the folks who worked on generating lists and ranking their relationships? I'd love to hear, how did you find it? Like I hear back from some of you that it was hard to determine how to rank a relationship. But what else did you see? What else did you learn? Gaspar, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, it was a really, really good exercise, I think, just to think about it. And, some of the things that jumped out for me is how the size of the circles really depended on where the speaker or the participant sits in the system. I think it was Ellie whose city agencies were really large circles. And, being in the mayor's office of sustainability, that makes a lot of sense. And then for the workforce providers, it was primarily workforce providers. But I think nobody had had proximity with the private sector. And those were the biggest circles for me, but also, NYCHA, DOT, MTA, real estate board in New York, National Grid, Con Ed, and Chambers of Commerce for me were really big circles, but there isn't a piece of paper big enough to put them in perspective to where they sit relative to Lower East Side Employment Network. So that I did enjoy the exercise quite a bit. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and thank you. And the step that we eliminated, and it's always good to learn too that we just need more time to do activities like this, and that's the overarching thing I'm hearing. But the step that we skipped is interesting, and you might want to do it on your own. That step 4, where you move yourself out of the center and pick one of your partners and put them in the center and try to think about what the world looks like to them, and how they might design that same map. And it really helps you think about the system and the flaws in the system. I think I saw a hand raised. So if anyone has something to say, just feel free to unmute yourself and chime in.
Hi, this is Tony. Gaspar comment made me think about this too, which is, the people, for many of us, what would be most important, our most important relationship would be with our constituents or the residents close, or those local businesses. But the people who are most important are either the people with the money, like NYSERDA, or the government or government institutions, right? So I think a lot of us may have met this point where have seen this in our work where, well, actually it's the government institutions that are the most important. They hold the money, they can make big change. But for us in the place we sit, we need to make the most effective change for our constituents or locally. And that's just a tension that we face in this world. But this network is pretty great because maybe now through the network, like Caspar was saying, okay, now I know someone who's really enmeshed in those bigger groups, and also who might be able to help me with my local work, or vice versa, or I see someone else has local partners similar to mine, and now we can work together with someone who's in the government or what it might have here with the unions. So I think maybe the next step is, as someone had mentioned before, is like, how do we make this one gigantic map that we all are a part of and see how we navigate through that? Thanks.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks for joining today. That's right. You know, you're all kind of hitting the nail on the head of what's the next step. And these are all the steps we take toward forming a network. And, you know, thinking about sector strategies, it's what you're saying about the relationships we have. And this is the very typical tension in workforce development, is that we serve constituents, which are generally job seekers. But do we need to kind of flip our thinking in how we serve employers? And how do we elevate their importance in, we see them as important, but how do we strengthen the relationships and kind of maybe move them to the center of the conversation, the way we think about this work? Because, you know, a true and working sector program and sector strategy is kind of sorting the labor market for employers, right? So our constituents are who we serve, but if we're also serving employers, we're making the best matches for them. We're matching them to people who are going to succeed. So we play this dual role of preparing people to succeed in a market, but we need to have the relationships with employers. So thank you all for that. I wanted to end by 11:45, so I'm looking at the time now for the first time. I know we blocked this out for 2 hours on your calendar, and it's a big ask without a real sufficient break. So we'll build that in for next time. But before you go, I'm going to ask Roman, my colleague, to share a link to the feedback form. We've had, you know, some consistent feedback from a few people in the group, and I ask all of you just to take a few moments. It's a short Google form. If you click on this link, it'll take you right to it. The feedback that we get from you really does help inform how we build each session, and how we work with you and how we think about the strategies to pull a network together. So the more you can give us back, the more we can give back to you. And we're scheduled for March 4th. So it's 4 weeks from today to come together again. We are going to continue to meet the first Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. There's also a link to registration. And we'll follow up in email. But this has been, you know, really a fruitful conversation. Both everything we heard from Chris. I love that his mantra kind of follow the money, and giving us some ideas of how to do that and where to do that. And that, you know, the reality is that it is hard. It's sometimes buried under, like he said, policies and agendas and bureaucracy. So we'll continue to do that together and figure out best ways to do that. And before we sign off, let me just invite anyone for final words, anyone from our leadership team, Green City Forest, Hope, New.
Feel free to share that presentation, Carrie.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, a few folks have asked for it, so I'll make a PDF of our full deck and share that out with this group.
I would just close by saying thank you all for being part of this community with us. I think that together we're smarter and stronger. And as someone just put in the chat, like, what do we need to do as a sector to finally get clout? I think together we can like map that and figure that out and be really strategic and intentional in our efforts to build a network that leads to the people that we serve getting good green jobs with sustainable career paths. So thanks everybody. This was great today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. And Chris, again, thank you for your time pulling that information together. It was wonderful.
Really great.
Thanks all. Till next time.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Carrie, is anyone hanging